In the autumn of 1911, when the mist clung to the pine forests of Blackstone County like a burial shroud, there stood a house where perfection came at an unspeakable price. The townspeople of Stillwater spoke in hushed reverence of Anatole Vane, the reclusive craftsman whose dolls possessed an otherworldly realism that brought comfort to grieving families across 3 counties. What they whispered behind closed doors was far more disturbing. Children vanished on moonless nights, their names carved into missing person reports that mysteriously disappeared from courthouse files. Deathbed confessions spoke of graves disturbed, of Potter's field burials that left coffins mysteriously light. The local coroner noted discrepancies in his ledgers, corpses that arrived intact but left his table somehow diminished. But the most chilling rumors centered on the dolls themselves. Visitors claimed the porcelain faces held too much humanity, that the glass eyes seemed to track movement across a room. Some swore they felt warmth beneath the painted skin, heard whispered pleas from tiny throats. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe because the story I am about to tell goes beyond anything you can imagine. The truth, when it finally surfaced in the spring of 1912, revealed horrors that made the whispered rumors seem like gentle fairy tales. For in that house, at the edge of Stillwater, the master craftsman had discovered the ultimate artistic medium, and his young apprentice had learned lessons that would transform him from student into the most terrifying artist of all. This was not just murder, this was an atelier where human beings became the raw materials for a monstrous gallery of grief. Stillwater earned its name from the brackish pools that formed where the Blackstone River slowed to a crawl through the valley's deepest point. The town itself huddled around Morrison's lumber mill, like children seeking warmth from a dying fire, its weathered buildings reflecting the gray permanence of poverty and isolation. The mill's constant drone of saws biting through pine created a soundtrack of industrial progress that masked darker sounds from the valley's edges. Steam rose from the mill pond in ghostly wisps, carrying the scent of wood pulp and machinery oil that never quite covered the underlying smell of decay from the surrounding wetlands. 3 miles from the town center, connected only by a rutted cart path that disappeared entirely during spring floods, sat the Vane property. The house itself defied easy description, a patchwork of architectural afterthoughts that seemed to have grown organically from the soggy earth. Clapboard siding, once painted white, had weathered to the color of old bone. Windows stared out like hollow eye sockets, most covered with heavy curtains that never stirred. Behind the main house, a series of outbuildings clustered like supplicants around a shrine. The largest served as Vane's workshop, its chimney releasing thin streams of smoke that carried an acrid sweetness locals attributed to the chemicals used in his trade. Those with sensitive noses detected something else beneath the preservatives. Something that reminded them uncomfortably of Sunday roasts left too long in the oven. The Blackstone River curved around the property's eastern edge, its dark waters reflecting nothing. Local fishermen avoided this stretch, claiming their lines came up empty and their nets returned torn. Children dared each other to cross the wooden bridge that connected Vane's land to the main road, but none lingered long enough to explore further. Mill owner Silas Gregg had commissioned the bridge's construction 15 years earlier, declaring that Stillwater needed to support its local artisans. What he never mentioned was the substantial discount Vane offered on his services, a professional courtesy that extended to Gregg's social circle. The wealthy families of 3 counties had learned to value the craftsman's discretion almost as much as his skill. In this landscape of willful blindness and convenient isolation, where economic necessity trumped moral curiosity, the house at the valley's edge became a pilgrimage site for those seeking to transform their deepest grief into something beautiful and permanent. What they never suspected was that the transformation involved far more than wood, porcelain, and paint. Anatole Vane arrived in Stillwater during the harsh winter of 1896, carrying little more than a leather satchel of tools and a daguerreotype of a woman whose beauty seemed to glow even through the faded silver. He rented the abandoned Thornfield place with money that appeared as mysteriously as he had, paying 6 months in advance with coins that bore mint marks from distant cities. The locals learned precious little about their new neighbor during his first years among them. He claimed to be a widower from the eastern settlements, driven west by grief too profound for civilized company. His wife Cora had died in childbirth, taking their unborn daughter with her, leaving Anatole with skills perfectly suited to preserving what death sought to claim. His reputation grew slowly, built on work that spoke louder than the man himself. When banker Morrison's mother passed, Vane crafted a memorial doll so lifelike that Morrison's children insisted it breathed. The piece captured not just the old woman's appearance, but something deeper, an essence that made viewing it feel like communion with the departed soul. A word spread through networks of grief and wealth. Bereaved families traveled increasingly distant miles to commission pieces from the quiet craftsman who understood loss. Vane worked alone, accepting only the most meaningful commissions, turning away casual collectors who sought his dolls as mere curiosities. Each piece required months of meticulous labor, every detail researched and refined until the result transcended mere craftsmanship. The isolation suited him perfectly until advancing age made solitary work increasingly difficult. His hands, still steady and precise, needed assistance with the heavier aspects of his trade. When Widow Maeve approached him about her young charge, Vane saw opportunity in the proposal. Elias Croft had arrived in Stillwater 3 years earlier, another orphan deposited by circumstance in a town that specialized in forgotten souls. At 17, he possessed the quick intelligence and steady nerves that Vane's work demanded. More importantly, he displayed the emotional detachment necessary for handling the more disturbing aspects of memorial art. Their arrangement began formally in October of 1911, with Elias moving into the small room above the workshop. The boy proved an exceptional student, absorbing techniques that had taken Vane decades to master. His questions were thoughtful, his observations acute, his dedication to perfection matching his master's own obsessive standards. What Vane failed to recognize in his eager apprentice was an intelligence that extended far beyond technical skill. Elias possessed the rare ability to see patterns others missed, to notice inconsistencies that careful men worked to conceal. Most dangerously, he combined this perceptiveness with the moral flexibility that had allowed him to survive as an orphan in an unforgiving world. For Elias, the workshop represented sanctuary, purpose, and the first real family he had known since childhood. The daily routine of creation soothed trauma he had never learned to voice, while Vane's quiet approval filled needs that years of institutional neglect had left raw and desperate. For several months, master and apprentice worked in harmonious productivity, creating pieces that enhanced Vane's already legendary reputation. But harmony requires balance, and balance becomes impossible once certain secrets demand acknowledgement. The day Elias was handed the key to the locked finishing room, their relationship began its transformation from mentorship into something far more dangerous and complex. The finishing room occupied the workshop's rear corner, separated from the main work area by a heavy oak door that Vane kept locked with obsessive consistency. For months, Elias had watched his master disappear behind that door for hours at a time, emerging with completed dolls that seemed to glow with an inner vitality that wooden armatures and porcelain heads should never possess. When Vane finally handed him the iron key, Elias felt the weight of trust and terrible responsibility. The room beyond contained the final secrets of the craft that had begun to consume his imagination with possibilities that both thrilled and disturbed him. Inside, shelves lined every wall, holding jars of chemicals whose labels bore no resemblance to the wood stains and varnishes he recognized. The air carried a peculiar sweetness, undercut by metallic notes that made his stomach clench with unnamed recognition. Workbenches held instruments that looked more surgical than artistic, their polished surfaces reflecting the amber glow from oil lamps arranged around the space. Vane instructed him to clean the room thoroughly, paying particular attention to the stains on the central work table. As Elias scrubbed, his cloth caught on something embedded in a crack between floorboards. Working it free with his fingernail, he discovered a small scrap of material, unlike anything he had encountered. The fragment felt organic but processed, supple as finest leather yet somehow more intimate in texture. It bore no resemblance to the cowhide and pigskin he had worked with previously, possessing instead a quality that made his skin crawl with instinctive revulsion. Most disturbing were the tiny holes along one edge, perfectly round and evenly spaced, as if the material had been carefully perforated with a needle designed for the most delicate work. Hidden in a drawer, he found the source of those holes. A curved needle lay nested in silk, its design unlike any instrument he had seen in their regular work. Beside it, spools of thread so fine it appeared almost invisible caught the lamplight like spider silk. The entire setup suggested techniques requiring precision beyond anything their public commissions demanded. When he brought his findings to Vane, the older man's reaction revealed nothing through expression, but everything through the subtle tension that entered his shoulders. Taking the scrap between careful fingers, Vane examined it with the clinical detachment of a medical professional, rather than the artistic passion Elias had learned to recognize. The explanation came in measured tones that carried the weight of absolute authority. Specialized taxidermy, Vane explained, required materials and techniques that conventional artisans never encountered. The most realistic memorial pieces demanded authentic components, carefully preserved and skillfully applied. The processes were complex, occasionally disturbing to the uninitiated, but necessary for achieving the emotional truth that bereaved families desperately sought. The words made logical sense, yet something in Elias responded with deeper alarm than rationality could address. Walking home through Stillwater's empty streets that evening, he encountered a group of children playing in the fading light, their voices raised in a sing-song rhyme he had never heard before. Doll man comes in the night, takes the bad children, makes them right. Pretty and still, never grow old. Doll man's children do as they're told. When he asked where they had learned the verses, the children scattered like startled birds, leaving him alone with shadows that seemed to move independently of their casting objects. The explanation Vane had provided remained plausible, but the feeling in his gut, the same instinctive revulsion he had felt touching that strange scrap of material, whispered that a different and far darker story was taking shape around him. The letter arrived on the first day of December, delivered by Silas Gregg himself rather than trusted to the postal service. Elias watched from the workshop window as the mill owner's carriage navigated the rutted path, noting how the horses seemed reluctant to approach the property, despite their driver's urging. Gregg emerged from the carriage like a man carrying invisible weights. His usual commanding presence had withered into something fragile and desperate, the transformation so complete that Elias barely recognized Stillwater's most powerful citizen. The mill owner's clothes hung loose on his frame, suggesting recent weight loss, while his eyes held the hollow quality of someone who had forgotten how to sleep. The meeting between Gregg and Vane took place in the main house, behind doors that muffled their voices into indistinct murmurs punctuated by long silences. When they finally emerged, both men wore the grim expressions of negotiators who had reached an agreement neither fully desired. Vane returned to the workshop carrying an envelope thick with currency and something far more precious. Wrapped in tissue paper, protected like a religious relic, lay a lock of hair so fine it seemed spun from sunlight itself. The golden strands caught the lamplight and held it, creating an aureole of radiance that made Elias's throat tighten with emotions he couldn't name. The commission details emerged slowly as Vane explained their new project. Lillian Gregg had been her father's pride and joy, a precocious child of 7 whose laughter had brightened even the mill's grimy offices. Scarlet fever had taken her in October, leaving behind parents whose wealth proved powerless against the democracy of death. Gregg sought more than a simple memorial. He wanted a companion piece, a doll so perfectly crafted that it could serve as a permanent surrogate for the daughter he would never hold again. The specifications were precise and heartbreaking. Lillian's exact height and weight, her favorite dress carefully preserved, even the small scar on her left hand from a childhood accident meticulously reproduced. The payment offered exceeded any commission in Vane's career, enough to purchase comfortable retirement or finance expansion into markets beyond their isolated valley. More importantly, it came from a man whose influence could ensure their work remained undisturbed by official curiosity or moral objections. Vane accepted with the solemnity of a priest taking confession, promising results that would justify the extraordinary trust being placed in his abilities. This would be their masterwork, he told Elias, a creation that would define their reputation for generations to come. As December nights grew longer and colder, the workshop took on an atmosphere of religious intensity. Vane worked with renewed passion, his movements carrying the purposefulness of a craftsman who had finally received the commission worthy of his ultimate skills. The wooden armature took shape with mathematical precision, every joint and proportion calculated to match the measurements Gregg had provided, along with his daughter's favorite dress. But Elias began to notice troubling aspects of their preparation. Vane spent increasing time in the locked finishing room, emerging with tools that bore no resemblance to their usual woodworking implements. The chemical smells grew stronger, more complex, carrying notes that reminded Elias uncomfortably of the slaughterhouse behind Morrison's butcher shop. Most disturbing were the late-night excursions. Twice Elias woke to the sound of the wagon leaving the property, returning before dawn with cargo that never appeared in the main workshop. When morning came, Vane would greet him with calm normalcy, offering no explanation for the nocturnal activities that left mud on wheels and a lingering sweetness in the air that no amount of scrubbing could fully eliminate. With the town's most powerful man now waiting for his daughter's effigy, and a deadline that brooked no delay, the need for specific pristine materials had become desperately urgent. Elias sensed that their next phase of work would demand techniques that conventional artisanship could never achieve, and that his education in the true nature of Vane's craft was about to advance far beyond anything his conscience was prepared to accept. The breakthrough came on a night when December's bitter cold had driven even the hardiest residents of Stillwater behind locked doors and banked fires. Elias lay in his narrow bed above the workshop, listening to the wind howl through gaps in the clapboard siding, when he heard the familiar creak of wagon wheels on frozen earth. This time something compelled him to investigate rather than feign sleep. Pulling on his heaviest coat, he crept down the stairs and slipped outside into darkness, so complete it seemed solid. The moon had set hours earlier, leaving only starlight to guide him as he followed the sound of hoofbeats toward the river. What he witnessed at the Potter's Field would haunt his remaining days with visions that no amount of rationalization could transform into innocent memory. Vane stood beside a freshly opened grave, conversing in whispers with a figure whose face remained hidden beneath a broad-brimmed hat. Money changed hands, followed by keys that glinted briefly in the stranger's lamplight. The harvest man, as Elias would later name him, worked with the efficiency of long practice. The coffin emerged from its shallow resting place with mechanical precision, loaded onto Vane's wagon as if it contained nothing more significant than lumber or grain. No words were exchanged beyond the initial transaction, yet both men moved with the coordination of partners who had perfected their collaboration through repetition. Elias followed at a distance as the wagon returned to the workshop, his heart hammering against his ribs with each creak of the wheels. He watched from concealment as Vane and his supplier unloaded their cargo through the rear entrance that led directly to the finishing room, noting how carefully they handled their burden despite its obvious weight. When the stranger departed and Vane finally retired to the main house, Elias found himself alone with knowledge that transformed everything he thought he understood about their work. The locked room now held secrets that extended far beyond unconventional artistic techniques, and his position as apprentice had evolved into something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Sleep proved impossible. Instead, he spent the remaining hours until dawn, wrestling with possibilities that his mind rejected, even as the evidence mounted beyond denial. The strange materials, the surgical instruments, the nighttime procurements, all formed a pattern that pointed toward conclusions too horrible for conscious acknowledgement. Morning brought no relief, only the terrible necessity of maintaining normal routines while wrestling with revolutionary understanding. Vane appeared for breakfast with his usual calm demeanor, discussing their upcoming work as if the previous night's activities had never occurred. His casual reference to beginning the specialized preparation for Lillian's memorial sent ice through Elias's veins. The day's work proceeded with agonizing normalcy, until Vane announced that Elias would observe the finishing room procedures for the first time. Educational purposes, he explained, essential for a craftsman who hoped to master every aspect of their trade. The words carried no menace, yet Elias heard in them the sound of doors closing on escape routes he hadn't even realized he possessed. The locked room had been transformed overnight into something resembling a surgeon's theater more than an artist's studio. Fresh lamps provided brilliant illumination focused on the central table, where tools lay arranged with military precision. The air carried chemical scents so strong they made his eyes water, underlaid with organic notes that triggered every instinct for flight. His body possessed. What lay on that table would remain burned into his memory long after the rest of his experiences had faded to bearable abstractions. Vane worked with the clinical detachment of a medical professional, his movements precise and economical as he demonstrated techniques that no legitimate artisan would ever need to master. The flensing process required delicate precision to preserve structural integrity while removing everything that would compromise the final product's stability. The treating solutions had been perfected through years of experimentation, creating materials more supple and durable than any conventional tanning could achieve. The stitching methods demanded skills that bridged surgery and couture, joining pieces with seams so fine they disappeared under casual observation. Through it all, Vane provided calm narration like a professor delivering a lecture to medical students. This was craft elevated to its highest form, he explained, art that transcended conventional boundaries to achieve emotional truth that mere representation could never match. The families who commissioned such work deserved nothing less than perfection, and perfection required sacrifices that weaker artists could never make. Frozen in place, watching his master work with materials that had once possessed names and dreams and futures, Elias understood that he was no longer an apprentice learning a trade. He had become a witness to atrocities that would ensure his permanent silence through methods he was only beginning to comprehend. And in the economy of this house, witnesses represented liabilities that required careful management. Before we continue this disturbing journey, I need you to hit that subscribe button. The depths of human depravity we're exploring here go beyond most people's imagination, and if you can handle what's coming next, you belong with us who seek truth in the darkest corners of history. The weight of terrible knowledge proved unbearable for a conscience still capable of moral distinction. Elias spent 3 sleepless nights pacing his small room, wrestling with obligations that pulled him in directions that offered no resolution. Remaining silent made him complicit in horrors that violated every principle he had absorbed during his brief, chaotic life. Speaking out would likely ensure his own destruction while potentially saving no one. On the 4th morning, desperation overcame caution. While Vane worked alone in the finishing room, putting final touches on materials that would soon become part of Lillian Gregg's memorial, Elias slipped away from the workshop and made his way into town through pre-dawn darkness. Widow Maeve lived in a neat cottage behind the seamstress shop. She operated with skills inherited from her deceased mother. She had arranged Elias's apprenticeship out of Christian charity mixed with practical concern for a boy whose intelligence deserved better than the mill's grinding labor. In the months since his placement with Vane, she had watched him develop from a hollow-eyed orphan into someone who possessed purpose and pride in skilled work. That pride had transformed into something far more troubling by the time Elias appeared at her door, his face gaunt with sleeplessness and his hands trembling with nervous energy that no amount of reassurance could calm. The story he told, delivered in whispered fragments between glances towards the window, challenged every assumption she held about the reclusive craftsman she had trusted with her young charge's future. The cipher journal he produced as evidence displayed his desperation to document horrors while maintaining some protection should the wrong eyes discover his records. Each entry detailed observations and suspicions in substitution codes that transformed his accusations into puzzles requiring interpretation. The effect was deeply unsettling, suggesting a mind under pressure that had found dangerous release through obsessive documentation. Maeve's reaction revealed the terrible isolation that protected Vane's activities from exposure. Her initial response was denial built on foundations of social stability that depended on maintaining comfortable illusions about respected community members. The accusations against Stillwater's most celebrated artisan threatened not just one man's reputation, but the entire network of relationships that defined their isolated society. Her secondary response was fear that extended beyond concern for Elias's immediate safety. Speaking against Vane meant challenging Silas Gregg's judgment in commissioning the doll that had consumed the craftsman's recent attention. It meant questioning the mill owner's capacity to protect his business associates from official interference and, by extension, threatening the economic relationships that kept Stillwater viable. The practical advice she offered reflected the constraints that trapped them both. Sheriff Hale was honest but pragmatic, more concerned with maintaining peace than pursuing justice that might destabilize his jurisdiction's delicate balance. Any accusation against Vane would require evidence far more substantial than an apprentice's suspicions and coded journal entries. More importantly, Elias's safety depended on maintaining his master's trust until some alternative could be arranged. Running away would mark him as a liability requiring elimination, while remaining in place offered opportunities for gathering the concrete proof that authorities would demand before acting against a man of Vane's standing. The council was reasonable, reflecting mature understanding of political realities that governed small communities dependent on powerful individuals for survival. It was also a death sentence disguised as cautious wisdom, though neither Maeve nor Elias possessed sufficient experience with true evil to recognize the trap they were constructing around their good intentions. Their conversation ended with promises that felt substantial but offered no practical protection. Maeve would make discreet inquiries about Elias's legal options while watching for opportunities to involve Sheriff Hale without triggering backlash that would destroy them both. Elias would continue his role as apprentice while documenting everything that might later serve as evidence, assuming he survived long enough to present it. The long walk back to the workshop carried him through landscape that had become sinister in ways he lacked vocabulary to describe. Every shadow might conceal watchers reporting his absence to Vane. Every sound might herald the approach of consequences he had set in motion through his desperate attempt to find salvation in a community that had already demonstrated its willingness to ignore uncomfortable truths. With the door to help closed by circumstances beyond anyone's control, Elias walked back into the lion's den, knowing that his master would soon realize his secret was no longer safe, and that witnesses in the economy of that house required management through methods he was only beginning to understand with the clarity that comes from absolute terror. Conscience proved stronger than caution in Widow Maeve's case. Though her decision to act came too late to provide the salvation she intended. 3 days after Elias's desperate confession, she appeared at Sheriff John Hale's office with accusations that challenged everything the lawman thought he understood about maintaining peace in his isolated jurisdiction. Hale listened to her story with the weary patience of an official who had learned to manage community tensions through careful balance rather than aggressive investigation. Her claims about Anatole Vane struck him as the product of an impressionable boy's overactive imagination, fed by the natural eeriness surrounding anyone who worked professionally with death. The cipher journal she presented as evidence supported this interpretation. The substitution code suggested paranoia rather than legitimate concern, while the content revealed suspicions rather than concrete observations of criminal activity. Nothing in the documented entries would survive legal scrutiny, and pursuing the matter would likely destroy the reputation of a respected craftsman based on an orphan's fevered imaginings. However, Maeve's obvious distress and the boy's continued absence from town warranted some official response. A cursory examination of the Vane property would either confirm or dispel the accusations, allowing everyone to move forward with clear consciences. The sheriff's decision to conduct this search represented the kind of reasonable compromise that small-town politics demanded when serious allegations emerged without adequate proof. The expedition to the workshop took place on a gray afternoon when winter clouds pressed down on the valley like a burial shroud. Hale brought Deputy Morrison and Town Clerk Davidson as witnesses, ensuring that whatever they found would be documented through multiple perspectives. The group's arrival at the isolated property carried an atmosphere of official duty rather than criminal investigation. Vane received them with the perfect blend of surprise and cooperation that characterized an innocent man confronting unexpected scrutiny. He expressed concern about Elias's absence from town, noting that the boy had seemed increasingly troubled by the intensive work their current commission demanded. Perhaps the isolation and technical challenges had proven more stressful than a young man of limited experience could handle. The tour of the facilities revealed nothing that contradicted Vane's reputation as an eccentric but legitimate craftsman. The main workshop contained the tools and materials expected in any advanced woodworking operation, while the storage areas held supplies and partially completed projects that supported his claims about current workload. The locked finishing room, presented as containing delicate work in progress, remained sealed at Vane's request to prevent contamination of specialized processes. This restriction seemed reasonable given the technical complexity he described, and none of the officials pressed for access to areas that might compromise valuable work through unauthorized exposure. Hale's examination focused on the practical details that would either support or refute the accusations they were investigating. The chemical odors that had alarmed Elias proved consistent with legitimate preservation techniques, while the surgical instruments had obvious applications in detailed reconstruction work. Nothing they observed suggested activities that extended beyond the boundaries of unconventional but legal artisanship. The search concluded with official apologies to Vane for the disruption caused by unfounded accusations. Hale assured the craftsman that the matter would be handled discreetly to prevent damage to his professional reputation, while noting that Elias's disappearance remained a separate concern that warranted continued investigation. After the officials departed, the workshop returned to its previous quiet efficiency with one crucial difference. Vane's friendly demeanor vanished the moment the last visitor disappeared down the rutted path, replaced by the cold calculation of a predator whose prey had revealed itself through premature movement. The deliberate turn of the key in the workshop's main door created a sound that echoed with finality through rooms that had suddenly transformed from workplace into prison. As that lock clicked shut, Elias understood from his hiding place in the storage loft that the search had not provided his salvation, but had instead delivered his sentencing, confirming his status as a liability that required immediate and permanent management. The confrontation began with silence more terrifying than any scream could have been. Vane stood motionless beside his workbench, one hand resting on the leather-bound ledger that contained the mathematical precision underlying his artistic achievements. His eyes held the flat calm of a craftsman, preparing to address a problem that threatened the completion of important work. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the warmth that had characterized their months of collaboration. The words emerged with clinical detachment, as if he were explaining technical procedures to a student who had demonstrated insufficient understanding of basic principles. Elias had learned the family trade, Vane observed, though perhaps not as thoroughly as circumstances now demanded. The boy possessed skills that marked him as potentially valuable, assuming he could develop the mature perspective that distinguished true artisans from mere technicians. Unfortunately, recent events suggested that this maturation process might require more intensive guidance than conventional apprenticeship provided. The ledger opened to reveal entries that chronicled transactions extending back decades, each line recording acquisitions and completions, with accounting precision that reduced human lives to inventory management. Names, ages, physical specifications, condition assessments, all documented with the attention to detail that quality craftsmanship demanded. Vane's finger traced down columns of figures until it reached the final entry, a blank line waiting for completion. The specifications listed there matched Elias's physical characteristics with accuracy that suggested careful measurement over many months of observation. Height, weight, distinguishing marks, all recorded with the clinical thoroughness that preceded every commission. The explanation that followed revealed a philosophy that transformed murder into education and artistry into consumption. True mastery, Vane explained, required understanding subjects from perspectives that external observation could never provide. The greatest memorial pieces demanded intimate knowledge of human construction that only direct experience could teach. Lillian Gregg's memorial would represent the pinnacle of his artistic achievement, but it needed context to reach its full emotional potential. A companion piece crafted from materials that shared her innocence and youth would provide the narrative depth that separated mere craftsmanship from transcendent art. The bereaved father would receive not just a reproduction of his lost daughter, but a complete tableau that captured the essence of childhood itself. Elias's role in this masterwork had been planned from the moment of his arrival at the workshop. His intelligence and technical ability made him valuable as an assistant, but his true purpose lay in providing the raw materials that would elevate Vane's final commission beyond anything he had previously achieved. The boy's education in craft techniques would ensure that his contribution to the project carried the understanding and appreciation that inferior materials could never possess. The tools laid out on the clean cloth represented instruments of precision rather than violence, designed for efficiency and artistry rather than crude butchery. The process would begin with techniques that preserved consciousness long enough for Elias to appreciate the transformation he was undergoing, ensuring that his final moments contributed meaningfully to the educational experience that death would provide. Vane's calm explanation of these procedures carried the certainty of someone who had perfected methods through extensive practice. Previous apprentices had contributed to his artistic development through similar processes, their materials carefully preserved for projects that honored their sacrifice through immortality that living flesh could never achieve. The blank line in the ledger waited for completion, its emptiness representing potential that required only Elias's cooperation to transform into permanent record. His name would join the list of contributors whose dedication to craft had transcended conventional boundaries, ensuring that his legacy would endure for generations through art that captured truth more perfectly than life itself could provide. Trapped with his name metaphorically already etched in his master's ledger, Elias understood that his only path to survival lay in rewriting that final entry entirely, transforming himself from victim into author of an ending that would demonstrate lessons learned through education that no traditional apprenticeship could ever have provided. The workshop transformed into a theater of terror as Vane prepared to conclude his apprentice's education through methods that would ensure permanent understanding of craft principles. Heavy curtains blocked the windows while additional lamps provided illumination that turned shadows into accomplices in the horror about to unfold. Elias found himself secured to a chair positioned for optimal viewing of the preparation ritual. Vane worked with ceremonial precision, arranging instruments according to sequences perfected through decades of practice. Each tool held significance in the process that would transform living flesh into materials worthy of the masterpiece waiting for completion. The older man's movements carried religious intensity as he explained the upcoming procedures with the enthusiasm of a teacher sharing treasured knowledge with a promising student. This was the ultimate lesson, he declared, the synthesis that would elevate Elias's understanding from mere technical competence to true artistic wisdom. But months of observation had taught the apprentice more than his master realized. Elias had studied not just craft techniques, but human psychology, learning to read the subtle indicators that revealed emotional states beneath carefully maintained facades. He recognized the obsessive focus that made Vane vulnerable to distraction, the perfectionist attention to detail that could be turned against itself. The rope securing his wrists had been tied with the same meticulous care that characterized all of Vane's work. But perfection required predictability that careful observation could exploit. While his captor arranged instruments in precise patterns, Elias worked his restraints against the chair's rough edge, using techniques learned during his years of institutional survival. Freedom came at the moment when Vane's attention focused most completely on his preparations. The craftsman's back turned as he heated specialized tools to precise temperatures. The apprentice moved with speed born of absolute desperation, crossing the workshop in silent bounds that covered distance before his master could react to the changed circumstances. The struggle that followed held none of the dignity that characterized the morning's careful ritual. Two men fought with primal intensity in a space filled with instruments designed for precision rather than combat. Tools scattered across the floor while lamps swayed wildly, casting shifting shadows that turned familiar objects into alien threats. Vane possessed the advantages of experience and premeditation, but Elias fought with the desperate strength that comes from facing imminent death. Youth and terror proved superior to age and confidence as the contest moved through different areas of the workshop, destroying months of careful preparation in moments of chaotic violence. The decisive moment arrived when Vane stumbled over debris from their struggle, his fall placing him within reach of tools that had been scattered during the initial confrontation. Elias found himself standing above his master, holding implements that had been intended for his own destruction, facing choices that would define the remainder of his existence. In that instant of perfect clarity, surrounded by wreckage that represented the collapse of everything he had believed about his place in the world, Elias experienced revelation that transformed victim into artist. The tools in his hands were instruments of education, and the materials at his disposal represented an opportunity to complete his apprenticeship through methods that would honor everything Vane had tried to teach him. The idea formed with crystalline perfection, not to kill and hide evidence, but to create something that would serve as permanent testament to lessons learned through education more intensive than any traditional master could provide. Vane had sought to make him the final masterpiece, but circumstances had reversed their roles in ways that offered far more interesting artistic possibilities. Standing in the wreckage of his former life, Elias understood that true mastery required more than technical skill or artistic vision. It demanded the wisdom to recognize opportunities when they presented themselves, and the courage to pursue them regardless of conventional moral constraints. His education was about to reach completion through methods that would honor his master's memory, while ensuring that the final lesson would be entirely his own creation. As the first light of dawn touched windows that had witnessed the transformation of apprentice into artist, the screaming from the house finally stopped, and a new and terrible artistry began in earnest. The discovery came 3 weeks later, when Silas Gregg's patience finally overcame his respect for artistic temperament. The mill owner had expected regular updates on his commission's progress, but the craftsman's workshop had remained ominously silent since the sheriff's visit. His carriage approached the isolated property through landscape that seemed more desolate than memory suggested, as if winter had claimed more than its usual portion of life from the valley. No smoke rose from the workshop chimney despite temperatures that demanded constant heating for delicate work. The windows remained curtained, but gaps in the fabric revealed darkness that suggested abandonment rather than privacy. Most unsettling was the absolute silence that surrounded buildings, where activity should have produced the familiar sounds of industry and creativity. Gregg's knock at the main house door produced no response, while circuits of the property revealed no signs of recent habitation. Tracks in the snow led only to and from the workshop, suggesting that whatever had transpired there had remained confined to that single building. The mill owner's growing alarm finally overcame his reluctance to intrude on professional privacy. The workshop door opened on a scene that would haunt the discoverer's remaining years, with visions that challenged every assumption about human nature and artistic dedication. The space had been transformed into a gallery where the boundaries between creation and destruction had dissolved entirely, leaving something that transcended both categories to achieve a horror more complete than either could accomplish alone. At the room's center, positioned for optimal viewing, sat the completed memorial to Lillian Gregg. The doll exceeded every specification the grieving father had provided, capturing not just his daughter's appearance, but the essence of childhood itself. Every detail was perfect beyond human capability, From the golden ringlets that caught lamplight like spun sunlight to the tiny scar on her left hand that only family members would recognize. But the masterpiece that dominated the scene occupied the chair beside the memorial, positioned as if admiring the completed work with paternal pride. Anatole Vane sat in permanent contemplation of his artistic achievement, his body transformed into a creation that surpassed every previous example of his legendary skill. The preservation process had required techniques that extended far beyond conventional taxidermy, creating materials that retained flexibility and expression, while achieving permanence that living flesh could never maintain. The positioning suggested a father's adoration, hands arranged to frame the memorial doll as if presenting a beloved child for admiration. Most disturbing was the expression that had been crafted with surgical precision onto features that had once belonged to the valley's most celebrated artisan. The face wore a look of paternal satisfaction so complete that viewers found themselves believing in the emotion despite knowing its artificial origin. The eyes, treated with chemicals that preserved their clarity while fixing their focus, seemed to follow observers with attention that suggested consciousness trapped within immobile flesh. The technical achievement was undeniable, representing craftsmanship that elevated previous work into preliminary exercises by comparison. Every detail demonstrated mastery of techniques that no legitimate artisan should possess, while the overall composition created narrative depth that transformed static display into emotional experience. But the most chilling aspect was the signature style that marked this piece as authentic work from the workshop that had produced so many treasured memorials. The same attention to psychological detail, the identical concern for emotional truth, the characteristic finish that made artificial materials indistinguishable from living flesh. This was unquestionably the work of Anatole Vane, created with skills that had made his reputation across 3 counties. The townspeople who eventually gathered at the scene reached the only conclusion that their sanity could accept. The reclusive craftsman had finally succumbed to the isolation and obsessive perfectionism that had driven his artistic achievements. His final work represented a masterpiece of madness, the logical endpoint of genius that had pushed beyond conventional boundaries into territories where art became indistinguishable from atrocity. The official investigation revealed nothing that contradicted this interpretation. Tools were arranged as if their owner had worked alone, while the positioning of materials suggested someone familiar with every aspect of the workshop's operation. The absence of signs indicating struggle or coercion supported conclusions about self-inflicted transformation driven by artistic obsession rather than external violence. What the investigators missed, and what Silas Gregg chose never to acknowledge, was evidence that told a different and more terrifying story. The empty apprentices caught, the missing specialized tools, the subtle indicators that suggested collaboration rather than solitary work. These details painted a picture of education completed through methods that honored the master's teachings while surpassing his wildest artistic ambitions. The town had discovered what appeared to be a tragedy, a madman's final act of creative destruction. But the careful observer might have noticed that this tragedy had been crafted with the same attention to emotional truth that had made every previous piece from the workshop a testament to love transcending death, suggesting that the real masterpiece was not the preserved artisan but the perfect deception that had fooled an entire community into seeing exactly what they needed to see. The fire that consumed the Vane property occurred exactly 1 week after the discovery, during the darkest hours of a moonless night when no witnesses could document its origins. Flames engulfed the workshop and main house with intensity that suggested professional methodology rather than accidental ignition. destroying evidence and artwork with equal efficiency. By dawn, nothing remained except foundations and the twisted metal remnants of tools that had once created beauty from materials that civilized society preferred not to contemplate. The heat had been so intense that even the specialized chemicals and preserved materials had been reduced to ash that mixed indistinguishably with the debris from more conventional destruction. No investigation was launched into the fire's cause, despite its suspicious timing and the valuable evidence it had eliminated. Sheriff Hale's official report attributed the blaze to natural causes, specifically the deterioration of the workshop's heating system following weeks of abandonment. The conclusion satisfied those who required official closure while avoiding inquiries that might have revealed uncomfortable truths about community knowledge and complicity. Silas Gregg refused to discuss the commission that had brought the final horror into existence, his silence extending beyond grief into what appeared to be shame or fear. The substantial payment he had provided for Lillian's memorial disappeared from all records, as if the transaction had never occurred. His daughter's grave received a conventional marker that made no reference to the artistic monument her death had inspired. The absence of Elias Croft from all subsequent records proved more troubling to those who remembered the quiet apprentice. Official documents suggested that he had fled the area following his master's death, possibly taking valuable tools and materials as compensation for unpaid wages. A reward offered for information about his whereabouts produced no reliable sightings, though several witnesses reported encounters with young men whose descriptions bore passing resemblance to the missing orphan. Widow Maeve's guilt over her role in the tragedy manifested in obsessive attention to details that others preferred to forget. Her statements to anyone willing to listen contained fragmentary references to cipher journals and disturbing discoveries that painted a picture far more complex than official reports suggested. Most dismissed her claims as the product of grief and misplaced responsibility, while others wondered what specific knowledge she possessed that might explain her persistent anxiety. The community's collective response demonstrated the human capacity for selective memory when confronted with truths that threaten psychological stability. Conversations about the events gradually shifted focus from questions about what had happened to agreement that dwelling on the past served no constructive purpose. The isolation that had once protected Vane's activities now shielded the community from external scrutiny of their desire to forget. Within months, the location itself began to disappear from local consciousness. Maps were redrawn to omit roads that led nowhere, while property records were consolidated to eliminate references to parcels that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The Postal Service discontinued delivery to addresses that generated no mail, completing the administrative erasure of a place that had become too dangerous to remember. Stories did survive, filtered through networks of gossip and rumor that transformed specific details into generalized warnings. Children still chanted rhymes about the doll man, though the words evolved through repetition into something resembling fairy tale rather than historical reference. Parents used these stories to encourage good behavior while avoiding explanations that might disturb developing minds with realities too complex for innocence to process. The official memory settled into comfortable patterns that allowed everyone to maintain necessary illusions about their community's essential goodness. The tragedy had been contained, its perpetrator punished through circumstances that suggested divine justice rather than human intervention. The victims had been mourned, the evidence eliminated, and the living had been permitted to continue their existence without confronting truths that would have made such continuation impossible. With physical evidence reduced to ash and witnesses scattered or silenced, the legend was forced underground where the darkest stories fester and grow, nourished by suppression and transformed by repetition into something more dangerous than truth itself could ever have been. The years that followed brought changes to Stillwater that gradually erased most traces of the events that had once threatened the community's peace. The lumber mill expanded its operations, bringing new families and diluting the concentration of residents who remembered the craftsman's house at the valley's edge. Progress, it seemed, could accomplish what fire and official silence had only partially achieved. But certain knowledge resists burial, manifesting in ways that prove truth's resilience against attempts at elimination. Urban explorers from distant cities began appearing in the valley, drawn by stories that had spread through networks dedicated to documenting forgotten horrors. Their metal detectors and archaeological enthusiasm threatened to uncover evidence that official reports claimed had never existed. The Foundation site yielded artifacts that contradicted the narrative of simple artistic obsession. Porcelain shards bearing two realistic facial features and metal implements designed for procedures that no legitimate craftsman would require, chemical residues that suggested preservation techniques extending far beyond conventional taxidermy. Each discovery reinforced suspicions that the official story had obscured rather than revealed the truth about what had occurred in that isolated workshop. More disturbing were the testimonies these investigators collected from elderly residents whose memories had been loosened by age and alcohol. Fragmentary confessions spoke of nighttime procurements, of graves that had been disturbed and coffins that had been returned empty to their resting places. The pattern suggested operations that had extended far beyond single incidents, pointing toward decades of activity that the community had chosen to ignore. A modern artist calling himself E.C., Morgan emerged in neighboring counties, creating hyper-realistic dolls that captured public attention through their disturbing perfection. His work displayed technical mastery that seemed to exceed contemporary training, while his publicity materials claimed inspiration from historical sources that had been recently discovered through archaeological research. Morgan's blog posts described finding a cipher journal in the ruins of an old workshop, its pages detailing techniques that conventional artisans had never developed. The translations he provided revealed methods that bridged medicine and craftsmanship, creating materials that surpassed anything that conventional preservation could achieve. His enthusiasm for these discoveries suggested someone who had found not just information, but calling. The dolls that emerged from Morgan's studio triggered responses in viewers that conventional art could never provoke. Parents reported that their children refused to remain in the same room with the pieces, while adults described dreams that featured the carved faces pursuing them through landscapes of impossible geometry. Gallery owners noted that the works seemed to alter their surroundings, making exhibition spaces feel smaller and more oppressive than their actual dimensions suggested. Law enforcement in 3 counties began documenting reports that bore uncomfortable similarities to historical patterns from the Stillwater area. Missing persons cases involving individuals who fit specific physical criteria, grave disturbances that left coffins intact but mysteriously lightened, chemical odors reported from isolated properties that investigations could never locate or explain. The official responses to these incidents demonstrated the same reluctance to pursue uncomfortable possibilities that had protected Vane's activities decades earlier. Resources were allocated to conventional explanations, while evidence pointing toward more disturbing conclusions was minimized or ignored. The pattern suggested that administrative blindness remained as effective a shield as community silence had ever been. Most troubling were the apprenticeship advertisements that appeared in publications dedicated to traditional crafts and memorial arts. The postings sought young people with specific qualifications and temperaments, offering education in techniques that were described as historical preservation rather than contemporary practice. The language carried echoes of earlier recruitment efforts, suggesting that certain knowledge was actively seeking new vessels for its continuation. The geographical distribution of these incidents revealed movement patterns that pointed toward systematic rather than random activity. A practitioner was traveling established routes, establishing temporary workshops in isolated locations before moving on to avoid detection. The techniques were being refined and adapted to contemporary circumstances while maintaining the essential characteristics that had made them so effective in their original setting. As reports accumulated from investigators and law enforcement agencies across multiple states, a pattern emerged that suggested the most frightening aspect of the Stillwater events had not been their occurrence, but their successful concealment. The craft, it seemed, had not died in the fire that consumed Anatole Vane's workshop, but had escaped on the road with a lone apprentice who had learned his lessons well and was now seeking opportunities to pass them on to the next generation. Hit that subscribe button if you're still with me, because what we've uncovered here is just the beginning. The techniques that were perfected in that isolated workshop didn't disappear. They evolved, and they're still out there, waiting for the right student to carry them forward into our modern world. The contemporary manifestations of techniques pioneered in the Vane workshop suggest that certain forms of knowledge behave more like contagions than traditional crafts, spreading through contact and reproducing themselves in new environments. The E.C. Morgan case provided the most documented example of this transmission, offering insights into how forbidden methods adapt to survive across generations and geographical boundaries. Morgan's background, pieced together through social media posts and public records, revealed a trajectory that paralleled Elias Croft's early life with disturbing precision. Orphaned young, institutionalized through adolescence, possessed of intelligence that found no constructive outlets within conventional educational systems. His discovery of what he claimed were historical documents had provided both purpose and methodology for talents that might otherwise have remained dormant. The cipher journal he referenced in his online materials contained techniques that no amateur researcher should have been able to decode, suggesting access to additional sources or guidance that his public statements never acknowledged. The methods described in his translations demonstrated evolution beyond historical practices, incorporating contemporary materials and tools while maintaining the essential principles that had made the original work so unnervingly effective. His studio investigated following complaints from neighbors about chemical odors and disturbing sounds, revealed equipment that bridged historical craftsmanship and modern medical technology. Preservation techniques had been refined using contemporary chemistry, while cutting implements showed design improvements that suggested ongoing development rather than simple replication of antique methods. Most troubling was evidence that Morgan had not worked alone. Multiple sets of tools, workstations configured for different physical proportions, and materials in various stages of preparation suggested a collaborative effort involving practitioners of different experience levels. The pattern indicated that knowledge was being actively transmitted rather than simply rediscovered, implying the existence of networks dedicated to preserving and advancing techniques that conventional society had rejected. The investigation's abrupt termination, officially attributed to jurisdictional complications and lack of physical evidence, followed a pattern that had protected similar activities for decades. Files were sealed, witnesses relocated, and public attention redirected toward more conventional explanations for the phenomena that had triggered official interest. The administrative machinery that had once shielded Anatole Vane demonstrated its continued effectiveness in protecting his intellectual legacy. Similar incidents in other locations revealed the geographical scope of contemporary operations. Reports from rural areas in 7 states describe discoveries that shared common characteristics: isolated workshops, specialized equipment, missing persons cases involving individuals who fit specific criteria, and official investigations that concluded without meaningful results. The pattern suggested coordinated activity rather than independent incidents. The recruitment methods had evolved to exploit contemporary vulnerabilities while maintaining historical effectiveness. Social media platforms provided access to potential apprentices whose profiles indicated the psychological characteristics that made them suitable for intensive education in unconventional techniques. Online communities dedicated to historical crafts and memorial arts served as hunting grounds for individuals whose interests aligned with the specialized knowledge that certain practitioners possessed. The most sophisticated operations had developed sustainable business models that provided cover for activities that more closely resembled Vane's original methods than Morgan's relatively crude attempts at replication. Memorial services, restoration workshops, and historical recreation organizations offered legitimate frameworks within which more questionable techniques could be practiced without attracting unwanted attention. The client base had expanded beyond grieving families to include collectors who valued authenticity above conventional moral considerations. Private museums, exclusive galleries, and individuals whose wealth provided insulation from legal consequences created markets for work that pushed boundaries beyond anything that public institutions would accept. These venues ensured that practitioners could continue their research while maintaining the financial resources necessary for acquiring specialized materials and equipment. The international dimension of these networks suggested that knowledge originally developed in an isolated American valley had spread far beyond its geographical origins. Reports from countries with different legal systems and cultural attitudes toward death and preservation indicated that techniques were being adapted to local conditions while maintaining their essential characteristics. What emerged from this pattern of contemporary activity was evidence that the most dangerous aspect of the Vane legacy was not its historical impact, but its continued vitality as a form of knowledge that actively sought new practitioners and applications. The craft had achieved a form of immortality through transmission that ensured its survival regardless of individual practitioners' fates, creating a distributed network of expertise that no single intervention could eliminate. The implications extended far beyond concerns about isolated criminal activity to questions about knowledge itself and the mechanisms by which certain forms of understanding perpetuate themselves across time and space. The techniques that had been perfected in that workshop represented more than simple criminal methodology. They constituted a form of cultural information that possessed its own evolutionary imperatives and survival strategies. In the end, the most terrifying aspect of the entire phenomenon was not that someone had once discovered how to transform living beings into permanent artworks, but that this discovery had proven impossible to bury, continuing to surface in new forms that adapted to contemporary circumstances while maintaining their essential horror. As we reach the conclusion of this journey into the darkest corners of human artistic ambition, we are left with questions that extend far beyond the specific horrors that unfolded in that isolated workshop more than a century ago. The story of Anatole Vane and his apprentice forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the relationship between creation and destruction, beauty and atrocity, teaching and consumption. The pursuit of perfect beauty has driven human achievement throughout history, inspiring artworks that transcend their materials to achieve something approaching immortality. But perfection demands sacrifice, and the line between acceptable cost and unconscionable price remains perpetually contested territory where individual conscience battles against artistic ambition. Vane's tragedy was not that he loved beauty too much, but that he came to see human beings as raw materials for its creation rather than ends worthy of consideration in themselves. His transformation from grieving widower to predatory artist illustrates how loss can corrupt the very qualities that once made a person valuable to their community, turning protective instincts into destructive obsessions. The apprenticeship that should have preserved and transmitted valuable knowledge became instead a mechanism for consuming those who sought to learn. Elias Croft's education progressed from conventional craft techniques to moral complicity to survival skills that ultimately required him to become the thing he had once feared. His final masterpiece was not the preserved form of his master, but the perfect deception that allowed an entire community to believe they understood what had occurred in their midst. This capacity for self-deception reveals the most disturbing aspect of the entire narrative. The residents of Stillwater possessed sufficient evidence to recognize the nature of Vane's activities, yet chose comfort over truth, economic stability over moral clarity, community cohesion over justice for his victims. Their willful blindness enabled atrocities that individual courage might have prevented, demonstrating how collective cowardice can create the conditions necessary for evil to flourish. The fire that destroyed the physical evidence and the administrative erasure that followed proved less effective than the community's collective decision to forget what they had learned. Memory, it turned out, was more fragile than physical materials, more susceptible to damage from neglect and deliberate distortion. The most complete destruction of evidence occurred in the minds of those who had witnessed its creation. Yet certain forms of knowledge resist all attempts at elimination, finding new vessels and applications that ensure their continuation across generations and geographical boundaries. The techniques that were perfected in that workshop have survived their creator and his apprentice, adapting to contemporary circumstances while maintaining their essential characteristics. What should have remained buried has instead proven itself capable of evolution and reproduction. This persistence raises troubling questions about the nature of knowledge itself and our responsibility for ideas that we encounter. Can certain forms of understanding be so dangerous that they should be actively suppressed, or does the attempt to bury knowledge inevitably ensure its survival in more virulent forms? The contemporary manifestations of Vane's legacy suggest that prohibition may be less effective than education in managing dangerous ideas. The networks that have formed around these techniques demonstrate how modern communication and transportation systems can amplify threats that were once contained by geographical isolation. What required decades to develop in a single location can now be shared instantly across global distances, creating distributed communities of practice that no single authority can monitor or control. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this entire phenomenon is its ordinariness. The individuals involved were not monsters in any conventional sense, but people whose circumstances and choices led them toward activities that violated fundamental human values. Their motivations remained recognizably human even as their methods transcended moral boundaries, suggesting that the capacity for such transformation exists within normal psychology rather than representing alien evil. The beauty they created was undeniably real, as evidenced by the emotional responses it generated in viewers who remained unaware of its origins. This paradox challenges comfortable assumptions about the relationship between aesthetic value and moral content, forcing us to acknowledge that genuine beauty can emerge from sources that our conscience must reject. If you've made it this far in our exploration of these dark truths, you understand that some stories resist easy conclusions or comfortable moral frameworks. Subscribe to join others who seek understanding in places where conventional wisdom fears to look, because the questions raised by cases like this demand continued investigation rather than comfortable forgetting. The house where every doll was made of flesh has been reduced to ash and memory, but the knowledge that was perfected within its walls continues to seek new applications in our modern world. The price of perfect beauty, it seems, is not just what we are willing to sacrifice to achieve it, but what we are prepared to become in its pursuit. And in that transformation, we discover that the most terrifying monsters are not those that haunt our nightmares, but those that we create through our own choices and the education we receive from masters whose lessons we should never have been willing to learn.